Cormac McCarthy fans, today we are talking about Mr. Arthur Schopenhauer and Cormac McCarthy. And one of my favorite parts about Cormac McCarthy is that he likes so many authors and thinkers that are today canceled because of some of their more extreme views. And no, today, unfortunately, we're not talking about Schopenhauer's view of women or minorities, but instead Schopenhauer's views on war and how they influence Cormac McCarthy. And McCarthy actually mentions Schopenhauer in Stella Maris 2 times in a very positive light. The first one is where he calls Schopenhauer the exemplar of German prose, which is a massive statement. If you think about the rich literary and poetic tradition of Germany, McCarthy just said that Schopenhauer was the best, which is really cool. He also mentioned Schopenhauer when Alicia is talking about music. They have this big dialogue about music, and she says, quote, Schopenhauer says somewhere that if the entire universe should vanish, the only thing left would be music. And the passage continues. That's pretty bold. Did he believe that? Probably not. Do you? I think he was just trying to establish its primacy, music, as a transcendent phenomenon, a thing which can exist with no assistance. McCarthy also briefly mentions Schopenhauer's concept of the will in Stella Maris also. But now let's move on to some even deeper relations that McCarthy has with Schopenhauer. And about 9 months or so ago, David Krakauer, the president of the Santa Fe Institute, wrote a piece on Cormac McCarthy called The Cormac McCarthy I Know. And in it, he talked about McCarthy's love for Schopenhauer, which we're about to read right here. It is reported that by his early 20s, Arthur Schopenhauer could read or speak fluently German, Italian, French, English, Spanish, Latin, and Greek. Besides the Tractatus, Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation should be included in Cormac's library of cherished works. Schopenhauer is a source of near infinite anecdotal remarks. His many quotable sentences are illustrative and seem to me to provide some of the parsimonious instruments by which Cormac structures his opinions of others. Quote from Schopenhauer, with people of limited ability, modesty is merely honest, but with those who possess great talent, it is hypocrisy. The greatest achievements of the human mind are generally received with distrust. End quote. Schopenhauer's relationship to his parents exemplifies the somewhat alien status of creative excellence in families. Cormac often laughs out loud when remembering a letter Schopenhauer's mother, Joanna, wrote to her son in 1807. Quote, all your good qualities become obscured by your super cleverness and are made useless to the world merely because of your rage at wanting to know everything better than others, of wanting to improve and master what you cannot command. If you were less like you would only be ridiculous, but thus as you are highly annoying, end quote. There's something cathartic in being made aware of the universality of lineal discord, and Johannes Schopenhauer takes it to another level. Wittgenstein was inspired by Schopenhauer's early work on the world as idea, an idealism that he summarized through The World is My Representation, which is precedent to the opening page of Tractatus. The world is everything that is the case, and the facts in logical space are the world. This kind of analytical compression, carrying a wealth of meaning, vertical and moral, provides a clue to the network of connections that spans many of Cormac's favorite thinkers. And if you've ever read Schopenhauer, you would have to assume his pessimism and some of his darker views on life were inspirational to McCarthy. But when I read that last night, I started going down the rabbit hole, and this is what I found. And before we get into that, David Krakauer mentioning Schopenhauer in league with Wittgenstein more so than most any other author other than, I think, Herman Melville's Moby Dick in this article shows how important it was to Cormac, because he would have conversations with people at the SFI about all these people. He wasn't a recluse when it came to philosophy and even literature, but just talking about writing fiction itself. And I'm sure he would also be open with that with people who were his, close friends, not some random person that says, oh, what happened at the end of Outer Dark? What's the triune? And so the only reference we have from Cormac about Schopenhauer comes from one of my favorite books of all time, a book that I think everyone in the audience out there should read right now. I've been saying it since I started this channel, and that is The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant, which Cormac McCarthy read. And I was given this book by a professor of philosophy when I was probably a senior, about to get my degree. I'd taken a bunch of philosophy classes, and I was asking him like, "Hey, like what should I read next?" And he was saying that a lot of your mind in terms of like Western philosophy is very disconnected. You know a lot about Nietzsche, you know about Francis Bacon because you did a paper on him and all this stuff, but you have to combine it all together. And Will Durant does that in the most beautiful and eloquent way because he is a phenomenal writer, like was living in the modern era, but had that classical mind and could write for an educated, was writing for a very educated audience back then, but also for laymen who, if went to school and tried, are more educated than the average person now. And Will Durant doesn't do what Bertrand Russell does in his History of Western Philosophy by going over every single little person and making a comment on it. He focuses down on about 10 philosophers, gives some important facts about their life, about their philosophy, and how maybe even their life influenced their philosophy. And if you also don't know, Will Durant wrote the Story of Civilization series, which is one of the greatest collection of history books of all time. And so he was very well versed in, all the historical aspects also. Some of the people that are obviously covered: Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, Francis Bacon, Kant, idealism, Schopenhauer, Voltaire, Herbert Spencer, Nietzsche, and then some kind of a compilation of contemporary European and American philosophers. And if you think you are smart, my professor, who got his PhD from Harvard, recommended this to me because he said, "I just read this and this blew my mind. This is one of the best books on philosophy I've ever read. You should maybe check it out." And so the link is down in the description below. There is my cell on Will Durant, who is one of my favorite writers. But back to the analysis. In box 35, folder 7 of the Blood Meridian Archives, McCarthy writes on a note, quote, "The bulldog ant is given in Durant's Story of Philosophy, Schopenhauer." But who the hell is Mr. Arthur Schopenhauer? And when we look at the start of the 19th century, it was a very dark time and a very weird era for art and philosophy. Around this time, the Romantic period started to die down, and the Napoleonic age was also dying down. And this led to a big tidal wave of pessimism because during the utopian and romantic heights of the previous artistic era, things like pessimism really weren't being explored by the greatest minds. And so for Schopenhauer, he was living through the end of the Napoleonic years, especially during his adolescence and formative years as a young man. And during the whole French Revolution and Napoleon experiment, there was a lot of utopian ideas being not just thought about and talked about, but put into action through war and in society. And sadly for everyone, it failed. And when you have such a big venture and such a grand vision and it fails, it creates a lot of resentment. But to make that even worse, after you have a massive war and demobilization across all of Europe, what does that also create? That creates a ton of economic strife because you have all these men who are now aimless, traumatized, injured, coming back to a society that is physically wrecked and psychically wrecked. And when we look at poets like Bryan, de Musset, Leopardi, Pushkin, Heine, and Lermontov, you see this pessimism coming out. But this pessimism wasn't just limited to literature. Composers like Chopin, Schubert, and Beethoven also had very pessimistic tones throughout their music. So going back to the idea of utopia, in the early 19th century, the idea of great men and these big dreams were not held by the upper class anymore. They saw what happened the last time they had those dreams and how they were treated. And Schopenhauer was born into a very good life. His father was in business. He taught his son business. And when his father died, he basically left him his trust fund. And Schopenhauer never really had to work for his entire life. He did a little bit of business in his as a young adult, but other than that, he did some very good investments in businesses, the economy, whatever. So he was able to be just a philosopher for his entire life. However, his father died from suicide, and supposedly his grandfather did also. And him and his mother had a very strained relationship because his mother believed that she was a genius, and she was a writer and very well-versed, a great communicator, friends with a lot of the bourgeoisie and high artistic figures of society, like Goethe, for instance. And so he decided to live apart from her because things were kind of awkward, because it wasn't like she was just really smart and like really great woman. She was very cocky about it, and she was into free love and like having guys over all the time. So Schopenhauer kind of felt like a little bit weird about all of that. And when Schopenhauer, as a teenager, young adult, was hanging out with Goethe and talking to him, Goethe told his mother that he was going to be a genius. This kid is a genius. And she told Goethe that she didn't believe him because she had never heard of two geniuses being in the same family. And that's a reference to her being a genius. And that's why, and you can tell, like we heard that letter. We just read that letter in the article by David Krakauer, and how she was writing to Arthur shows that massive amount of tension between them. And supposedly their relationship ended when she pushed him down the stairs and like hurt him really bad. But as a guy who like talks crap about women all the time and how weak they are and how obedient they are, maybe he was just really mad that he got manhandled by his own mother in his own house. So then after that era, Schopenhauer just becomes a philosopher, and he doesn't really achieve any fame until the end of his life. Around this time, guys like Hegel, Schelling, and the whole idealism crowd were very big, living in the same area, and Schopenhauer was a polemic. He would attack them directly. And once again, they were focused on metaphysics and the political, and Schopenhauer was focused on something much darker. And even though, like I said, pessimism was big at the time, in the university and academic circles, it really wasn't. Schopenhauer's, you could say, magnum opus was published, and no one ever read it. It was eventually used as waste paper for fires. And Schopenhauer believed it was so good that all of his later books were just remixes of that book. It was almost like he was like a rapper, and he was like sampling himself for new beats. And one further note before we get into the philosophy, it's interesting that McCarthy likes Schopenhauer, or I guess I should say it isn't, because Schopenhauer is in the Heraclitean lineage. If we go back to the but early Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who was very influential on Blood Meridian and Cormac in general. And further down the chain, we eventually get to Spinoza, Schelling, Schopenhauer, and then Nietzsche, and then Henry Bergson, and that is also my favorite philosophical lineage. It's so fun. And one of Schopenhauer's main idea that's important to McCarthy is the will to live, and this comes up ad infinitum in his work. And basically, Schopenhauer says that he views the will over the intellect, because the intellect may tire, the mind may become unclear, but the will, if it's present, will persevere forward towards something. So the will is the essence of man. And Schopenhauer goes so far to even say that the will is the secret thing in life, is the thing that we seek within ourselves, the secret. And if you go far enough, the will maybe can even transcend death. And this is where things start to get interesting and somewhat Gnostic. Schopenhauer argues that, much like Aristotle, that the philosopher does not seek pleasure, but the absence of pain. Because if we have this strong will, right, if I'm projecting my will out into the world, it's going to be desiring things that I'm never going to be able to achieve. I want this YouTube channel to have 5 million subscribers and people to start to read and do all this stuff, and I don't have to work the job I don't like anymore. But instead, as I aspire for those things, I'll be let down, even if I project my will intensely into it. And this kind of comes back to a deterministic view of reality, that even guys like Voltaire, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, said, we're going to leave the world as wicked and foolish as we left it. And both Schopenhauer and a lot of the guys at this time were very condescending to the dumb, I don't know what we call them. Every time I say this on the channels, I get comments like, you're arrogant. Like the sleepers, the dumb people, what do we call them? The NPCs? If we want me to be nice, the people who maybe wake up but they stuff themselves and their trauma with TV, food, and other pleasures so they don't have to feel anything. Like, what are we supposed to call them? And Schopenhauer argues something else that I would deem to be true. And in kind of McCarthy novels, we see something similar. The higher the knowledge, the higher the suffering. For Bobby and Alicia in Stella Maris and the Passenger, they are suffering because they are so intelligent, because they are functioning at a different level. The judge, even though he is at the top of the hierarchy, he is suffering most of all. He is the least free of everyone in Blood Meridian because he is serving this dark reality, this dark will, or madness, wherever we want to say, that's driving him. And that's the same for people like you and I. The more books I read, the more I participate in life, the more I realize that people don't care and how hard a real awakening or a utopia is actually going to be. And Schopenhauer finally argues that life is evil because life is war. And we're bringing it back to Cormac now. And Schopenhauer says, quote, every species fights for the matter, space, and time of the others. And so this is actually the section right here, and a little bit after that we're going to read, where McCarthy is drawing from in relation to the bulldog ant. So let's read that passage now. Quote, but the bulldog ant of Australia affords us the most extraordinary example of this kind. For if it is cut in two, a battle begins between the head and the tail. The head seizes the tail with its teeth, and the tail defends itself bravely by stinging the head. The battle may last for half an hour, until they die or are dragged away by the other ants. This contest takes place every time the experiment is tried. So now we're at another impasse in terms of analyzing McCarthy and like the judge in terms of Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer talks about the primal will, but the judge, you could argue, really embodies like the superficial, like worldly will. He uses it for song and dance and war. But Schopenhauer believed like the highest will is found through art, found through meditation, or like being a devout religious person. And that will is a way to escape kind of the craziness of what he would view of like the lesser will. But then we see the judge, even though he is a bit of a superficial individual, he never sleeps. He never dies. And he does kind of embody that religious renunciation, even because he's out there, in the desert. That is more I think it does align with Schopenhauer's will at some level. And obviously Nietzsche built upon Schopenhauer, and that is much more influential, but we can see kind of the threads happening in Blood Meridian. However, an interesting note about Schopenhauer is through all of his pessimism, he also is a believer in heroes. Along with Goethe and Carlyle, Schopenhauer tried to revive the idea of the genius, of art, and their importance, because during that era, we have guys like Hegel and Marx who are trying to diminish that idea of the great man, of the genius, of the Übermensch. Oh, excuse me, I shouldn't say Übermensch. Every single time I mention Nietzsche, I get some nerd being like, the Übermensch isn't meant to come for 500 more years. Don't say that. Speak about an elevated human. That's what you really mean. You're not talking about Nietzsche's Übermensch. All right, guys. All right. Anyway, and so we actually kind of see some of these elevated heroic characters all throughout McCarthy's works existing in a pessimistic world. The kid at some level, the boy in the road, John Grady Cole, and especially Billy Parham in the Border trilogy. These are all very heroic characters who are pessimists. And a lot of them see and reject the illusion of the will, like of the kind of lesser will. They're not after anything big and what can you really attain in the road, but the kid is having a sense of characterization throughout the novel, and so are the two protagonists throughout the Border trilogy. They're not seeking for anything material. They're seeking a feeling. They're seeking something greater than themselves. And I think that would align somewhat well with Schopenhauer's vision. So I will see you guys in the next video, hopefully on another philosopher's relation to McCarthy. And let me know your thoughts about McCarthy and Schopenhauer in general. Peace.